Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Michaela Booth. Micheala works for Prison Healthcare Services, engaging patients in prison in the design, delivery, and evaluation of healthcare services. Her current project is leading the implementation plan for peer mentoring, training, and delivery within 47 prisons in England. Micheala has a first-class degree with honors in applied criminology and is a postgraduate student halfway through her master's degree in crime and justice. In 2020, she won a national runner-up award from the Criminal Justice Alliance in the category of Outstanding Individual for her work leading peer support provision with prisons. This project also won a high commendation from the Health Service Journal in the 2020 Patient Safety Awards. Micheala's passions include advocacy for equity and inclusion, social justice, and the synthesis of lived experiences into broader social dialogue. She's an avid blogger and public speaker on criminal justice issues and women's experiences of criminalization, and her research interests include lived experience, research ethics, power, and the use and misuse of trauma narratives. I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today to talk to you about what pushed you to overcome the societal stereotypes and stigmas stemming from your life and your educational experience. So welcome, Micheala.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm very excited to have you on as well. Micheala, if you can just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, your life, and some of your experiences growing up.
Sure. So apart from the obvious information that you've just shared in my introduction, I was born into a family of drug addicts. My parents were in active addiction to hard drugs. Both of them throughout my childhood were involved in criminal activity, suffering from serious mental illness, drug addiction, compounded by the experiences of being parents to three young children. So my childhood was very traumatic. My childhood was mostly based around survival on a day-to-day basis. That continued up until I was 17 and I had my daughter. My dad then went to rehab in Spain. He tried various different rehabs throughout the course of my life, all really based in England where we live, and none of them were really ever successful long term due to coming home to his friends, the same environment, my mum who was still a drug user. And when I got pregnant, I think that was a big milestone in his life. I was very young. It was going to be his first grandchild, and I think that was a big turning point for him. So ever since then he's been in abstinence-based recovery. He's still in Spain. He comes back sporadically, and he's been around 17 years absolutely free from any drugs. Following on from that, active addiction, I've also then been a big part of a recovery journey, which was really triggered by my pregnancy as a 17-year-old. My mum still suffers with mental illness, drug misuse to this day. So I know part of my introduction was talking about a kind of synthesis of lived experience, a point that I always try to make when I talk about my life in a broader kind of social narrative, is that many people who face social inequalities as a result of mental illness, drug misuse, these experiences never really go away. If you've been impacted by poverty, by mental health, drug misuse, those social stigmas, that discrimination, and also living with it, they're not things that ever go away. So when I talk about lived experience, it's very much a living experience. So I still experience recovery from addiction because my dad's in a 12-step recovery program, which means he will, for the rest of his life, be a recovering drug addict. My mum still suffers with mental illness. So much of my life now as an adult is still caring for someone with a mental illness who still has problems with drug use. And I think that's not just personal to me. So most of the people that I know in my social circles that have similar experience to me as a child, they're very much still in lives that are impounded by social inequality, that are impacted daily by stigma and discrimination. And I think that it's really important for us to be mindful and understand that lived experience is very rarely something in the past. So I can talk about my childhood trauma now from a perspective of not being in that trauma anymore as a child, but I am still facing daily trauma and trauma triggers when I'm supporting my mum, who I know has been using drugs and is in a state of psychosis, and I'm a 31-year-old mother and woman myself. And that's very difficult when I then think back to all of the times that I was an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old child being massively neglected, not having my needs met. And I would always like to think, well, I did like to think ahead of time when I was younger and think that maybe at one point in my life, I may move away from having to survive life with a parent that wasn't parenting like I parent my child. And I still haven't got there. So it's not an easy situation for me to live in. So you mentioned in my introduction that I recently graduated with a first class degree. So that was my graduation actually happened this year in June. It was stopped last year because of COVID, and I went to university as a mature student and was one of the oldest in my class. So I went to my graduation with my daughter and my sister, and everybody else was there with their mum and dad. And if you think about all of the kind of symbolic pictures of graduations, it generally the picture that you have in your head is you with your parents, who are massively proud that you've gone to university and you've got a degree, and they want to be there to celebrate it. And I'm not saying this that my parents aren't proud of me and that they didn't want to be there to celebrate it, but my dad's in Spain and he can't get back to England because of the pandemic. And my mum was busy with DJing on her decks that she plays in the kitchen. So just to kind of really pin down how some of those experiences affected me as a child. So it was very, very traumatic, but I really try and avoid using a narrative that places me in a victimhood identity. So I actually never knew that my experiences were different from anyone else's, because that was the only life and only family that I'd ever lived with as a young child. That really began to change even in primary school. So my first vivid memory of exclusion was at primary school. And my parents were often late picking me up from school. Probably every day they were late. And no one else's parents were late, really. And if they were, they had a valid reason. There was traffic, or they had to work late, or there was an emergency. Not just that their parents were off their heads on heroin and forgot to go and pick their kids up from school, which was the case for me most of the time. And I vividly remember being in the outside playground at school, and the teachers taking a group of children who were also there past the deadline, past the school bell ringing, taking them to the dining room hall where the children sat to wait for their parents if they were late. And one of the teachers said to the other teacher that was leading the children to the hall, "Oh, don't worry about those three, their mum's always late." So we waited in the corridor while all of the other kids went to a dining hall to do their arts and crafts, or to have a carton of milk and an apple where they waited. And I mean, at primary school age, did I know that that was discrimination? Did I know that I was being actively excluded from education provision because my parents were drug addicts and I was facing that secondary discrimination? I knew that we were being left out. And I didn't have the knowledge or the language or actually the behaviours to express what that really meant. And actually that was no fault of my own. That was an education provision that was failing in its duty to look after children. And I didn't know that. And that was one of many experiences. And all of those experiences really, it just imprinted on the person that I am and the person that I grew up to be. So much of that now has probably stemmed into me being absolutely dedicated to equity and understanding all about the impact of discrimination and stigma, and how labeling is really used to mark the bodies of what society deem bad people. And that's exactly what happened to me. But I really try to view this through a systemic issue rather than individual people who were less than what they should have been at my time in need. And I often think, no, I don't often think, I often want to think that many of these individual people didn't know what was happening, but they absolutely knew what was happening. We had police chasing mum's boyfriends over the school in drug chases at primary school. Mum went to prison when I was at primary school. They absolutely knew that we were three kids living with massive trauma, and we continued to get detentions for not doing our homework. We continue to be embarrassed in front of people for not doing our homework, for not having the right uniform, for being hungry and asking for food.
There was blatant disregard for doing anything to improve the lives of these three young children.
Absolutely. And it's really sad to look back and say that. And I often look back and try and think about what was good during those times, what was helpful. And I just really don't actually want to believe that all of those people knew and never did anything. But it really is the case. And when I first applied to go to university, I had, through secondary school, I had got permanently excluded from school at the age of 15, just before I was due to sit my GCSEs. So I left school with no formal qualifications. And then I had a baby and I went to prison. And when I came out of prison and applied to go to university at the age of 26, the course leader that I had spoken to on the phone invited me in for a meeting, and she'd given me a question to write a very small essay about, to kind of check my academic ability. And I took that into her on our meeting, and she briefly skim read it, and then we had a really great conversation, and the meeting finished with her taking me to the admissions office and being admitted onto the course. And I look back now and I think that woman and her engagement with me was the first time in my life at the age of 26 where I'd ever met anyone that believed in my potential to be successful. And that to me tells me that, thinking back to my childhood experiences of school, it's not just bitterness and resentment. There actually isn't anything there that I can hold on to and recognize as good, because as soon as it happened in my life at the age of 26, I absolutely know that woman was the woman that changed my life. And she did that because she spoke to me. She got to understand who I was as a person, what had happened to me as a child, and how I wanted to use those experiences for the greater good. And her background in social work, she used to be a social worker before she became an academic, and she also used to be a probation officer. So it was almost like all of the people that had failed me in the past and all of the services that had failed me in the past was embodied in this woman that really understood the systemic failings of these services. And she just absolutely 100% supported me, and still does to this day. She left the university actually while I was halfway through my degree, but we've remained in contact. I messaged her on the day of my graduation in my gown, and she texted me back, and she was just so elated and sad that she couldn't be there because of COVID. I recently bought a house, and something that I'd visualized for ages was my daughter putting the key into a house that I bought for us. And that really stems from lots of experiences as a child living in really insecure accommodation. And as soon as I took the picture, I sent it to her, and I was like, look what's just happened. This would never have happened without you. And it really was that woman that changed the trajectory of my life, and all of the support that she's given me. And she very much reminds me of the fact constantly that she never did anything. That's her job. That's her responsibility. And that's the responsibility of universities, is to let people go there. So whilst I have this huge sense of gratitude towards her, she doesn't even accept it. So she's very much like, I haven't done anything for you, Micheala. You've done all of this yourself. And it's amazing that you've done all of this yourself. And I think that's so important. So whilst I have this amazing feeling towards this lady, because I know what she's done for me, and I know that those opportunities don't come my way or the way to people who've had my experiences very often, she really just sees that as part and parcel of normal life. And what that's taught me, which I very often talk about in conversation, is how policy and practice is structured systemically to be oppressive. It's not by accident that people are excluded and discriminated against. And it's not by accident that people face all of these stigmas. And actually, if we're all sat here waiting for policy to change, for legislation to change, nothing will ever change. And for all of my experiences that have led me to some degree of success, it's been individuals that have taken that personal responsibility to be inclusive. And that has been what has led to my success in terms of my career and in terms of my academic practice. It's not policies or procedures or legislation that has helped me. Mm-hmm. It's people that have met me and saw my potential and thought, this person needs a chance, and they've given me a chance.
She listened to you and she valued you. What's important in the end is investing in people and knowing that there is some good in everyone, and what can we do to make that happen. You had said that your parents were addicts, and when siblings come from families of that nature and have those types of backgrounds, often they go down the same path. So my question for you is, it sounds like that drugs maybe wasn't something that was for you, and how did that happen with your siblings? Did they go down that same path, or did you all recognize this is a problem and stay away from it?
So drugs does not impact my life or my sister's lives. Both of my sisters are really successful women. They have high-flying careers. They own their houses. I think what trauma did to us was build up a survival mechanism in us, which means that we can adapt and work in any situation. So I was recently doing a talk within my working role, and I was talking, someone had asked me a question about how did I react when I arrived in prison for the first time. I wasn't expecting to go to prison, certainly not on the day that I went to prison. Never been to prison before, and I remember being picked up from the court in a prison van to take me off to the prison. It was a November night. It was cold. It was raining. It was dark. I've never felt a feeling of being so scared in my whole entire life. I can feel it now, and it just sinks my stomach, that feeling of absolute terror. It was absolute terror. And I remember vividly thinking, how am I going to prison? Like, this has got to be some kind of experience that isn't really happening to me. And I was thinking, like, my mum's the kind of woman that goes to prison. Like, how am I going to prison? And within a week, I was in the prison regime. It was still absolutely horrific that I'd left behind a daughter, but my ability to adapt in traumatic environments, it just turns on. And there's a really interesting book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is about the impact of trauma in your actual kind of body, in your nervous system, how this kind of plays out when you experience trauma, and how your body has developed. And because I experienced so much trauma from the day I was born, my body, my actual being is just in a state of trauma reaction. So it's about survival. And I think that if you look at the trajectory of my life so far, I had massive childhood trauma for all of my childhood. I was expelled from school. Even when I was at school, I wasn't learning. I was being naughty. I was often being bullied because my parents were on drugs. We lived in a council estate. Our house was always being raided by the police. So it wasn't just at school. Everyone on our estate knew. We didn't have those secure attachments with our parents. We didn't have secure attachments with teachers. We had nobody in our lives, apart from our grandparents, that we didn't see that much. Apart from when our parents were in rehab and we'd go and stay with them, we had nobody. So I think now that kind of how my body has developed in a survival mode has really been a benefit to my future life. So I went into academia with no qualifications, absolutely hated school. I absolutely hated it. Never did I ever aspire to go to university. I thought they were all posh twats. Like, I'm not going to fit in there. Why? Like, I wouldn't even want to. And I got there and I absolutely loved it. It was the best time of my life. I came out with a first class degree. I literally sat in the library for 3 years with books, with my laptop, like studying constantly. And I never got bored of it. Writing assignments I found stressful, and loads of times I was like, I'm never doing this again. I can't cope, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as I thought, oh my God, like, what am I going to do after I finish my degree? I'm going to do another degree. Like, I just absolutely thrived in that environment. And I think that, how could I possibly thrive in that environment with no prior kind of experience of that environment, apart from absolutely hating education? And it's simply because I have got this ability to survive in any environment and do it to some degree of success. And that's the same for my job. So I was, my manager at the time of coming into the role had found one of my blogs on the internet, and I was writing about reintegration after a prison sentence and the impact of social stigma and discrimination on the lives of people that the system says should be rehabilitated. So the lives of the people that are released from prison to come and reintegrate into society, and all of the barriers that I'd faced in terms of employment. I can't use Airbnb. There's just so many different things that still impact my life on a daily basis, and I began to write about that. My old boss at the time read one of my blogs. He sent me a message on Twitter, actually, and asked if I would like to do some work with them in prison healthcare and service user involvement. We didn't really know what it looked like at the time. There wasn't an actual job. No one had done it before. We had a very informal interview at a train station. We met at a train station, and he gave me a job then and there. And it was a national role. It was in the senior leadership team in a massive private independent healthcare organisation. I mean, I'd worked in Woolworths before, and I'd worked in another retail shop before, and I was only 2 or 3 months into my degree at that time. And 3.5 years later, I'm leading that service into winning national awards for patient safety, winning awards for leading on peer support projects, creating new roles in the business for people that have been to prison, who we know struggle in society to get jobs, and absolutely thrive in a busy organisation that is fast-paced, moving quickly, because that is how I've always lived. It's different. It's obviously very different, but that trauma is always about survival. So it's just ingrained into me that whether I'm in academia and I've never been here before, I came out of it with a first class degree. Last year was the first year of my master's degree. I moved house. It was the start of the pandemic. I had to have time off work because I was suffering with my mental health. And only 2 weeks ago, I got my first year grade for my master's degree, and I got a distinction. I've got absolutely no idea, no idea how that happened. But I was just piecing all of these things and kind of looking back at it and thinking, how have I actually done that? And it is a result of trauma, and it's a result of being built to survive. and that's what I mean when I talk about survival being a transferable skill, because it's so ingrained into me as a person. I've always been a risk taker. Like even little things like passing my driving test. The very next day I was driving on the motorway. A week later I got a new job, which meant I would be driving down the motorway every day. And I've always been like able to take risks, and I don't really get scared about making big decisions. And I really do think that is the impact of trauma and survival in my early childhood years. So if I've got anything to be thankful for, it's definitely that I have an ability to survive in what are generally stressful and challenging environments. And I try and do it with a smile on my face. That doesn't always work.
In a positive attitude. Yeah. Micheala, do you think that that you say, you know, trauma is a transferable skill? Do you think that that's something that can be positively cultivated into somebody who's going through traumatic experiences, or do you think it's a personality trait or an individual trait, and you either have it, that you know, that trauma as a transferable skill, or you don't? Because I know earlier you had talked about that victim or, you know, mentality, and, you know, do you think that trauma is something that could be positively cultivated with the right relationships and the right, you know, people investing, or do you think that it's just something that you either have it or you don't?
It's a very interesting question, and it's definitely a question that I've never really thought of before. However, I don't think it's just a personality trait. I think there are parts of my personality which are very stubborn. I've always been very stubborn. I've always been very assertive my whole life. Aside from the experiences of trauma, I'm a Leo. I'm very fiery. I always have been in every single part of my life. What I would say is, if we try and think about cultivating these survival skills as positive skills in people that face trauma, and we begin to wonder whether you can navigate those experiences to some degree of success, or you can't, and then we begin to put that down to personality. So it depends on your personality. So what we do in effect in that instance is possibly write off a whole group of people, because we say, well, you can't do it because it's not in your personality, but they can because it's in their personality. And actually, my stubbornness and my assertiveness has made me very resistant to social stigma and inequality and discrimination. That part of my life has made me invested in studying it, understanding it to the best of my ability, finding the language to articulate it, and really looking at systems and structures of oppression and the consequences of that oppression on groups of people. So I think if we went down the road of thinking some people have got that natural ability to survive and some people don't, those people that don't, which there are people that experience severe trauma and they don't survive well. And I would say in those instances, that's the internalization of systemic and structural oppression. So it's nothing to do with the individual as a person and their skills. Their skills just aren't there because they haven't learned to view their situation as a systemic and social failure, which most people who are in oppressed groups are in those groups because us as a society have not got the structures or systems in place to get them out of oppression. We think about the free school meals. Whose job is it? Whose job should it be to feed kids that can't afford to eat? It's a state responsibility. And we've got a footballer who's got that lived experience of living in starvation and living in poverty, who is driving the change to make sure kids eat. What does that say about a society? So I think for me, it's definitely not a personal trait of mine. What happens in the instances where people can't navigate it is because of the impact of stigma and that self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you've been told that you're worthless for so long and you're never going to achieve anything, or you've been to prison and you can't get a job and you apply for 50 and you don't get one, mm-hmm. you're going to give up. I am just stubborn, and part of what I think my success has been is really resisting that stigma and actually being able to talk about this as a systemic issue that is failing people, rather than me being a failed person. I'm not a failed person. No. I go and apply for a job and someone doesn't give me a job because they see I've ticked a box that I've got a criminal conviction. Yeah. That's not me failing as a person. I'm trying to do something, and the system and the structure that's in place to exclude me is working. That's why we have a tick box on job applications, so we can exclude people that tell us that they've been to prison. It's not by accident.
Absolutely.
And most of the time, it's not even to do with a risk assessment, because you have jobs that don't even require a risk assessment that ask you if you've got a criminal conviction. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's loads of conversations that people can have in terms of justification for this. It's not justification. It's excuses to legitimize your exclusion of people that society mark and label as bad people. That's the nitty gritty of it. And I'll never be told any different. And that is why I just keep going, because I can see that so many of my experiences are shared with hundreds and thousands of people, and all of them are really not down to me or them making poor decisions. We've lived in environments with systems and services that have failed us massively. Mm-hmm. And it's someone else's responsibility to put that right, and they're not going to put it right because it's not by accident. And I think it's really important that people understand that these structures of oppression aren't done by accident. So I talk very much about the labeling of people with convictions, about calling people offenders, ex-offenders when they've left prison. People, I mean, there was a book that a prison officer had wrote. He'd left the prison service and he self-published a book. It was absolutely disgusting, giving away former prisoners' personal information, talking about his own risk assessment of self-harm before he'd consider calling someone from house care, absolutely just confessing to neglect of people in prison, to really hit that kind of political debate of people in prison being disgusting and drug addicts and not worthy. This shaming people isn't by accident. And actually, that book that I was talking about was a well-read book, because it's absolutely shaming people. And we as a society, we like to shame people. So if you think about Jeremy Kyle, if you think about the programs on the TV like Rich Kids Go Skin or Benefit Street, we have a culture where shaming people that are living in poverty or through deprivation is wanted. We want to see it. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, watching Jeremy Kyle, it makes me feel better about my life? Yeah. We like to hear about that misery and that pain. And for women that have been to prison, people like to keep us in those stories of misery and pain, because we can help support that academic research on vulnerable women in prison. No one's researching how do successful women that have been to prison navigate those spaces in big organizations and lead lead change in a systemic way. No one's doing that research. Why aren't they doing that research? Because we're not giving that painful, vulnerable narrative, and we're actually saying, actually, all of those life experiences have made us really strong. They've made us really dedicated and determined for social justice and inclusion. And no one wants to hear that, because we're not giving away that pain and that trauma that makes people feel, one, better about the circumstances they live in, or two, makes them feel like they're doing something to help us by writing an academic paper which sits behind a paywall and helps them get a promotion, but doesn't actually help any of the vulnerabilities that women face in prison. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And there's never that narrative. You rarely ever hear the narrative of, a good people, like prison, in prison situations, say specifically women in prison. You don't often hear that narrative of, them being good people caught in bad situations, or like you said, previous, history and traumas putting you into that situation, and being a good person, and then then there's all those barriers that you face in the access to positive employment opportunities, sometimes even buying a house. I know that becomes a situation in the US specifically, that if you have a prison record, often you can't get any types of loans to purchase a home. So, even though you are a good person that was caught up in a bad situation, and you did your prison time and all of that, you come out, and then you have all of these barriers that continue to push you down and push you down and push you down, instead of, where is the narrative of those who are bringing you up, or who are, or giving you the opportunity to share the positive story, the good experiences, the fabulous things that are happening, and how you are. Your whole contribution to society is completely different based on your experiences, Micheala, and what you've gone through, and now what you're doing to contribute to society. You're more of a contributing citizen than many academics and people that I've come in contact in my life that didn't have those traumatic experiences. So where is that narrative? And we definitely need to hear more of that. The positive narrative.
Yeah, we do. And actually, I had written my undergraduate dissertation on the value of lived experience in the criminal justice system, which focused specifically on women that had been to prison that now work in the criminal justice sector in a leadership role. And part of my main argument was we're invisible, we are voiceless, that's done to us through the environments that we work in, the organizations that we work with, who want to take the credit and get the glory of employing someone that's been to prison. And actually our value is simply for a tick box exercise in the sector to say, yeah, we employ someone that's been to prison, or most of the time you can come and volunteer with us, so we'll take your time, we value you, but you're not going to go on the payroll. We're not going to help you to alleviate you from those social structures which will see you living in poverty, see you not be able to pay your rent, live on universal credit, but volunteer with us, give us your time, we'll get the kudos for it, and you will still be on benefits, excluded from the labour market, but we've given you a chance and you should be grateful for that. That's the narrative that is very often portrayed in criminal justice and the utilisation of lived experience in those roles. And I really wanted to move away from that. So lots of the literature review was around the depictions of women in prison. So really historically, hundreds of years ago, and a comparison to what those depictions are now. Those depictions are exactly the same. So if you think that we're talking about women that have experienced trauma, women that are drug addicts, women that have been abused as kids, women that have been raped, and hundreds of years later, we're still sending those same women to prison, and nothing, like at what point do we think actually this system of punishment isn't working? Because we're still getting the same churn of women coming into prison. So that was much of the kind of literature review was around the narratives that we use to talk about women in prison, women that we criminalize, women that we don't want in society, because that's what it is. We'll send these women to prison, it's easier, and that's just a cycle that will continue to perpetuate. And in the first instance for my dissertation research, I was initially told that I wouldn't be able to research women that had been to prison because it was a risk. That's ridiculous. I've been to prison and I'm in your university on a criminology degree. Like, I just don't know how that can be justified. These women will be in leadership roles working in the criminal justice sector. If you wouldn't exclude me from working with leaders within the justice sector as part of my degree that didn't have a conviction or hadn't been to prison, why are you excluding these women? That could be me facing exclusion again from research that your university is carrying out. So first of all, I had to even fight to be able to do the research. There was absolutely no way I was going to change the direction of my research. And then I remember writing my interview questions, and I went to review them with my supervisor, and she had said, these questions aren't very academically written. And I said, I know, because the people that I'm researching and asking the questions to aren't academic.
Yeah.
And she just couldn't get her head around it. So I'm asking questions to people that really have similar life experiences to me. If I wasn't here in this academic space, I'm not going to write questions that I wouldn't have understood prior to me starting this degree. And they were in management and leadership roles, but that academic language that we are taught to use, if you've never heard, like, I see words and I think, how do you even pronounce that? And I'm Googling it, like, pronounce this word for me. Like, that's how I live.
Same here.
Doing my degree. Like, so I know how language can be so exclusionary, and actually what that means for people when they don't understand something is it leads to shame and embarrassment. And what does shame and embarrassment lead towards? Withdrawing from society and developing really unhealthy coping mechanisms to not be embarrassed. And all of those life experiences that I've had really cultivated me into a person with such great academic awareness. I'm not writing for academia. I want this degree, I want this research to benefit the women in my research. I want this to be a platform of their voices, and I want them to read it and think, that's helpful, thank you for doing that. That, like, what can we do with this now? How can we use this? Not, I don't understand a word that says, Micheala. Congratulations on getting your degree, but what does that mean? So there was those experiences of talking about language, and me saying that I have an awareness of my research cohort, and this is how it's going to be. And if you need me to write that in my write-up, that's what will happen, but it's not changing. And then part of the ethical approval process is obviously making participations anonymous. So I was very much of the perception that I don't want my participants to be anonymous. That is a part of academia invisibilizing people, especially women that have been to prison, criminalized women that you seek out for research constantly, and you don't name them. So we participate in this research that produces this new knowledge, and you might give us a £20 Love to Shop voucher if we're lucky, and you put a footnote saying thanks to the participants. What do we gain from that? If you want to make research that has a benefit to the lives of the research issues that you are focusing on, and it's more than just a career trajectory for you, or promotion, or wanting and needing to publish, how are we as research participants ever going to be able to contribute to that knowledge and have that attribution? So this is about attribution, and I was reading a lot about the functions of attribution as part of my research, and one of the main functions of attribution is punishment. So if you've done a really bad piece of work, you get told off for it, you get told to go back and to do it again and revisit it. And if you do a really good piece of work, you get that organizational respect, you get that individual respect, you get promotions, you get a pay rise, all of those things that happen when you produce good work continuously. So if you, as a named author on a research paper who says their focus is on criminalized women as an example, because you feel passionately about alleviating those systemic oppressions that lead to the criminalization of women, and you're not having paid criminalized women on your research cohort within your budgets that you get for this research that you're carrying out, and you're just in and out of prisons with an interview schedule and some vouchers and saying thanks to the participants in an interview, and they've got absolutely no attribution, you've done absolutely nothing to alleviate them from the things that lead them to prison, and the things that will lead them back to prison when they come out of prison. So actually you're continuing to narrate the traumas and the vulnerabilities of women in prison as a cycle which continues to perpetuate exclusion, because that exclusion is perpetuated in society that continues to read about the vulnerabilities and all of the kind of horrific things that have happened to women in prison. And then as a society, we get some of that narrative that comes out in the sector, or in politics, or through the Daily Mail. And that just stems back into society, who then legitimize the punishment of those women because they're drug addicts, because they've been prostitutes before, not because we as a society continue to write about these women as vulnerable. We ignore anyone who is really strong and has got a voice and can really talk about systemic oppression of these women. And we continue to just go in and out with our research papers, publish these journals, and that's it. So I really wanted my participants to be named. It was refused through the ethics process, which I was expecting. So I focused a lot in the write-up around our invisibility and academia's role in visibilizing and making us voiceless, and getting the attribution from our knowledge. So I talk about us as women being the teachers. So we as academics, we think about questions, we think about gaps in knowledge, and we want to go in there and we want to get these questions answered and produce a piece of writing which contributes to knowledge. Every time I'm talking about my experiences, whether I'm being a research participant or whether I'm sat in an office with my supervisor, talking to her about language that's excluding people from participation, I'm teaching these people what I know from my lived experience. So when this research is produced and written up, that's my knowledge that someone else has gone away and put their spin on it or theorized it. And actually, I could read that when it's published and think, that isn't what I said at all. That's what you think I said, or that's how you've written it because that's who's funded your research. And this is what you really need to say to get that next bit of funding. So that's kind of how this all happens. And I had to make my participants anonymous, but I asked each and every one of them, if you could be named in this research, would you want your name in it? And all of them said yes. the justification for anonymizing participants in the research is always down to risk. Who are we as an institution and as a discipline to put that risk on somebody who doesn't want that risk to them? We're not here to do things to people. Women that face oppression have things done to them their whole lives. And actually, if we want to move away from oppression and we want to move into inclusive cultures which give people choice and autonomy, and we ask them as a research participant, would you want to be named in this? And they say yes. Who are we to say, well, actually, no, because we think it's a risk? That's how we live our whole lives, people doing things to us. And that's sustained through academia. And I think me having those experiences has really challenged my thoughts on my place in academia, and actually, do I want to be an activist or do I want to be an academic? And is there space for both? Is there space for a really challenging voice that was oppressed and is working in an environment which is oppressive to people like me? And it's something that I haven't quite got to grips with yet, but I said earlier that I absolutely love being a student, and I just can't think of being anything else anymore. But I don't quite know what that looks like moving forward yet. But we'll see.
You know, you're very gregarious, and you know, I say stand up for, you know, what you believe in and change those mindsets in research. The point of you doing this research is to make a contribution to the field, contribution to knowledge, and contribution to society. And if you can't say at the end of your research, when you submit that thesis, that you have a way of disseminating it, taking and spreading it out within society and doing something good with it out in the world, into the wider community, then what contribution have you made? And I think that is the mentality that researchers should have. It's your research. It's not your supervisor's research. It's not your university's research. It's yours. It's your baby. You're going to take 4 years to give birth to it. So you do it, you know, in a way that makes you most happy. And that's my piece to you.
Thank you.
You know, Micheala, what I'd like to know now is, you know, what is your aspirations for the future?
My aspirations for the future, I think, in terms of further education post graduation from a master's degree, I'm still thinking about that, so I'm not quite sure what that looks like. In terms of more broader aspirations, I want to support platforming the voices of women that have been to prison. I want to help support a shift away from vulnerability and victimhood and talk about our strength and survival. And I want more people to hear about our stories and our strengths. And that is an aspiration for me, is that we stop creating and sustaining this conversation about vulnerable women, because we will always remain vulnerable if we live in societies what aren't pumping strength into us. If we're not taking that individual responsibility to see trauma and actually recognize that there is strength in surviving trauma. If someone survives trauma, they are a strong person, and it's about finding and tapping into those strengths. My main aspiration is just to really stop using criminalized women as the vulnerable targets for research and the vulnerable targets for criminal justice poster girl rehabilitation. This is what it looks like, look what we did, and to really start investing in people who have experienced trauma to tap into what their strengths are and find out what their own aspirations are, as individual women with individual stories and individual ambitions and aspirations themselves.
Mhm.
And I really don't want to be the voice for women, for criminalized women. What I want to do is put the mechanisms in place systemically so we draw out those voices. So people often get me to talk and have a misconception that I might come and talk about criminalized women in prison. Every single woman in prison had a different journey to me. They had a different story. We might share trauma. We might very much relate to each other as women, as our experiences, but I'm not a voice to talk to them. And very much in my work, in my organization, I'm not the prisoner voice. I make the methods and the models of gaining prisoner voice so we can all hear everybody's voice. And I think that my aspiration is just to continue in my professional role to develop that, and to enhance how we hear everybody's story and understand better how we can support individuals rather than seeing people in prison as a big group of vulnerable people that need dedicated, constant support, and we'll plan that support for them and give it to them, because that never works.
And I absolutely love what you said there, because rather than policy and practice in people placing a ceiling height on at whatever level they feel that a person can aspire to, it's really asking somebody, what is your aspiration? How far do you want to go? How high is your sky? And then supporting them, listening to their voices, and then supporting them to reach those aspirations. And I think that's key in what you were saying there. So we're coming to the end. Obviously, we're getting towards the end of our conversation here, which it's been just amazing for me. You are such a source of inspiration, and so positive and so forward thinking, and definitely a champion for equity and equality and social justice and the rights of the voice of others, the marginalized and the oppressed in many ways. So do you have any final words of wisdom to share with us before we say goodbye?
This is something that I really, really thought about often when I was in prison myself. And I can't remember who said it to me, but I'm sure someone said this to me at a point in time where I was in trouble. And I've just flipped that, which I generally have done in every situation in my life where I've been in trouble, to use it as a positive, which I just think this quote just absolutely sums up my life perfectly. And what they said to me when I was in trouble was, everything you do in the dark always comes to light. So kind of like, if you do something naughty or bad, like someone at some point in time is going to know about it and hear about it. And when I was in prison, I did lots of distance learning courses when I was in prison. Generally read quite a lot, tried to do as much kind of self-education as I can. And I live by that. Like, what you do in the dark always comes to light. So now I see that as having those dark days as all of my trauma, and having that prison experience as really dark days in my life. But the light at the end of that is all of the work that I've put in to survive. It's all of the work that I've dedicated to learning myself, making sure that I know things that I'm talking about, dedicating my kind of professional and personal life really to the cause of social justice. And I think that for people that are in prison, when the women asked me this the first time, and for anybody that is going through really tough times in their life, is to understand that everything you do in those days, even though you don't realize it at the time, even if you're just surviving, it's going to come to light, because you're going to see another day. If you survive a really dark night when you're in tears, the light is going to be in the morning, and you can really use that to kind of a really broad range of experiences. And I just find it really funny that the first time I heard it was when I was in trouble, and it was almost like a telling off, like people are going to know you've done that. And I've just flipped that, and like I think about it all the time, and I really use that now, that was a telling off, to really spur me on in difficult times, because it will come to light, and I just have to persevere in those challenges. And I've just like ingrained that into my being, and I hope it will be useful for other people, because it's been so useful to me.
And you know what, Micheala, you are a person who exudes that idea of, when somebody says to you, you can't do that, or you won't be able to do that, you definitely are the person that says, just watch me, and does it. You were just so positive, and I've really appreciated you taking the time to come and talk to me about your own lived experiences, and how you can be triumphant over adversity. So thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt, a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.